Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things and unexpected discoveries you can make if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, your host this week, and as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, I have to tell you, I'm feeling violated right now. Someone got access to the room I use to record these podcasts, and he stole my microphone, which the listeners might already know if the sound quality is really bad, because I had to put together a jury-rigged setup so that we can record this and buy myself some time to, I guess, buy another mic.
Yeah, boy, that really sucks. I'm sorry to hear that. I guess this is why Americans are buying guns. You're going to need a gun to defend your microphone, right?
Absolutely, yes. When I order a microphone, I'll also order a firearm to make sure it's the last one that I have to order.
Or set it up so anyone who touches your microphone gets shot.
Oh, yeah, I like that idea.
Through like a trap.
And I cannot imagine a more ironic opening to our episode for this year, for this week, because today's topic is altruism. And I asked you this question because it's something that has literally been bothered me for years. And maybe that tells you something about me, that I would be bothered about something like this for years.
Yeah.
Which is going back for more than 20 years, I've been coming across people who argue that altruism doesn't exist. And I'm aware of two academic disciplines that have staked this position out. Maybe there's more. The first is behavioral evolution, which claims that just evolution weeds altruism out of our genes. If it was ever there, it's not there anymore. And the other is economics. And so I've always found this troublesome. I don't like the thought that scholars are thinking that when I'm generous, I'm just pretending to be generous, because ultimately that works in my own self-interest. And so I sent you off on this, hopefully to find an explanation for me and tell me, why do these scholars argue that altruism does not exist, and whether you personally feel that they're right. So what did you find?
All right. Well, thank you for the question. Can I give you my hot take? Because that's a thing with podcasters. Hot take.
The hotter and spicier, the better.
Okay. My hot take is that regardless of whether altruism is a myth, you are pretending, Mark.
Damn it. Found out so soon. We're only a few minutes into the episode. Well, okay. The jig is
right.
up, but let's continue.
Here's something that surprised me. The term altruism wasn't coined until the mid-19th century by the French philosopher Auguste Comte. I would have guessed it originated much longer ago, maybe derived from Latin or Greek, especially since all the world's major religions promote altruism as a fundamental moral value. But regardless of the word's origins, philosophers and other humanists have been thinking about the concept of altruism for thousands of years. More recently, physical and social scientists have conducted experiments attempting to measure it. It's an important topic in the fields of psychology, evolutionary biology, and ethology, which is the study of animal behavior. I can't possibly cover all that ground in one episode of Mansplaining. Instead, I'm going to say some things about altruism generally, and then drill down on a few details from your question that help me refine my own view. So when I research a question for this podcast before going to the Google machine, I often start by consulting the most trusted reference source in my home library, and that's my dog-eared copy of Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. I have the 10th edition published in 1993, the same year the Macarena was recorded, but before it became a hit. So please don't ask me to research the Macarena next time.
No, I would, if I were to send you after a dance, it would be the forbidden dance, the lambada.
Okay, I should have known that. There are two definitions of altruism in my trusty dictionary. The first is a general definition, and the second is a little more specific. Here's the general one. Unselfish regard for or devotion to the welfare of others. And here's the slightly more specific spin. behavior by an animal that is not beneficial to or may be harmful to itself, but that benefits others of its species. I saw altruism defined in a TED Talk as, quote, a voluntary, costly behavior motivated by the desire to help another individual, end quote. And Wikipedia says it's the principle and moral practice of concern for happiness of other human beings or other animals, end quote. So let's pause right there for a minute and think about whether we've seen those behaviors in the world. I would hazard a guess that we've both known or at least know of people who fit those definitions, right?
Sure.
The world just lost Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa, who was unquestionably a paragon of altruism as I just defined it. But even in my own life, I can come up with examples, like my favorite high school English teacher or the woman who rescued my dog. You want to name anyone from your life, Mark?
Putting me on the spot. You know I have relatives who listen to this.
Well, I didn't name any of my relatives, so.
Well, the obvious figure who's in my mind is not from my personal life, but it's Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Day is quickly approaching. But I would definitely think of my mother in many respects as a self-sacrificing figure who put my interests ahead of her own.
Right. So here's why I put you on the spot. Before we consider complicated arguments for and against pure, quote unquote, pure altruism from the worlds of science and economics, I think it's instructive for everyone who's listening to this episode to remind ourselves that we've all either been on the receiving end of altruism or experienced it with our own eyes. What's the opposite of altruism? Most people would say selfishness. Implicit in most definitions of altruism is that altruistic acts are performed without the expectation of reciprocity or compensation. If you think about it that way, then the more precise opposite of altruism is not selfishness, but spite, since spiteful actions harm others with no self-benefit accruing to the taker of the action. We can infer from the various definitions I read that at its essence, altruism is about benefiting others in a way that doesn't benefit yourself, and indeed is at some cost to yourself.
Right.
Let me tell you right now that I didn't see any serious arguments that altruism doesn't exist. The debates raging in philosophical and scientific circles are more about whether altruism exists in some true or pure form, devoid of self-interest.
No.
In those debates, altruism is usually set against egoism, in which self-interest is the foundation of behavior.
Okay, so they're trying to imagine some pristine laboratory conditions in which self-interest has no effect whatsoever on your behavior.
Yes, that's correct.
Or cannot be to any reasonable extent impugned as an element of your behavior.
Yes, and there are scholarly voices on both sides of that. And I'm going to talk a little about this now. According to Wikipedia, the theory of psychological egoism is, quote, the view that humans are always motivated by self-interest and selfishness, even in what seem to be acts of altruism, end quote. Psychological egoism's pure version is that whenever people choose to help others, they do so because of personal benefits that they themselves expect to obtain from so doing, whether directly or indirectly. Less severe versions argue that at least one of the motivations for our actions is always a desire for our own good, or that we sometimes act altruistically, but never when we think that doing so would make us worse off. The adherents of psychological egoism, who included philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and Jeremy Bentham, believe that because altruism never happens for non-self-interested reasons, therefore it's never pure. At minimum, altruistic actors receive intrinsic reward for their actions in the form of personal gratification.
Okay, so if I'm understanding the argument, the idea is that just the fact that you are motivated to perform the act makes it to some extent a self-interested act. Like, for imagine if you're jumping into
That's
a
right.
river to save a stranger who's drowning, it's a self-interested act by that definition simply because you feel like that is something that you should do and that you would feel good about yourself having done. Is that correct?
Yes, or maybe even a little more nefariously that, what kind of newspaper headlines could you make by saving somebody? And how would that accrue to your sense of self or your perception in the
Sure.
world? Yeah, any and all of those things. So I mentioned psychological egoism because it's one of many examples I found of arguments against pure selfless altruism. Here's another. Richard Dawkins, a British evolutionary biologist, published his most famous work, The Selfish Gene, in 1976. We could do an entire podcast on this book. It was one of the most influential science books ever written. But the quickie summary is that it posited a gene-centered view of evolution and natural selection, as opposed to organism-centered or group-centered. Dawkins's book built on the groundbreaking work of other evolutionary biologists in the 1960s who argued that, to quote one of them, W.D. Hamilton, the ultimate criterion which determines whether a gene will spread is not whether the behavior is to the benefit of the behavior, but whether it is to the benefit of the gene, end quote. Which is to say, survival of the fittest is a drama in which the gene is the principal actor. The organism or group is just the vehicle for genes to, quote, gang together into large communal survival machines, end quote.
Right.
How do you like that, where humans are survival machines?
Yeah. I imagine Richard Dawkins was lots of fun at a party.
Yeah, right. He was also a ardent atheist, so I think he definitely has a lot of contrarian genes in his genetic makeup. So he argues in The Selfish Gene that altruism, like everything else, arises through the gene-centered prism. Here's another quote. There are special circumstances in which a gene can achieve its own selfish goals best by fostering a limited form of altruism at the level of individual animals, end quote. In Dawkins's view, selfish genes give rise to altruistic individuals. That is, the selfish actions of genes lead to acts of unselfishness by organisms.
So, on the premise that if you are a man who's known to self-sacrifice, then that might impress women enough to increase the likelihood that you will pass your genes on to future generations?
Perhaps. Yeah, right. He mentions two main ways that this happens in the book. One way is through kinship, which Dawkins calls kin selection. Dawkins believes that the more closely two individuals are related, the more sense it makes for them to behave cooperatively, since by helping a related organism succeed and ultimately reproduce, a gene succeeds in creating more copies of itself. Another way is through reciprocal altruism, which is a fancy way of saying tit for tat. If you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Individuals living in groups develop genes for performing favors like grooming when they're likely to be paid back in kind.
Mm-hmm.
In the world as seen by Dawkins, these limited types of altruism exist, but pure altruism, kindness for kindness' sake, doesn't exist. In fact, Dawkins wrote that pure altruism, quote, has no place in nature, something that has never existed before in the whole history of the world, end quote.
That seems like a pretty big claim. I could, I
Yeah,
can,
sure does.
I can see where he would argue that that would, make an organism less likely to survive if it's susceptible to pure self-sacrifice. But how could he possibly know that it has never existed in the history of the world?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that was the problem with the dodo, is that the dodo was a creature of self-sacrifice and pure altruism, and that's why it died out. It seems for a scientist, that seems like a scientifically indefensible claim.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And maybe that's why his book was such a a bestseller and appealed to so many people because of these bold claims. But I want to pause again for a minute to consider the adjective selfish as used in the title of Dawkins's book. It seems to me an odd and anthropomorphic choice for describing a non-intelligent substance like a gene. Dawkins stated unequivocally that he wasn't implying that genes were driven by any motivation or will, only that the effects of genes can be described as if they were so driven. The genes passed on are those that serve their own interest in being replicated and not necessarily the interest of the organism. Dawkins later became concerned that the title of his book, which attributed motivational attributes to something that was fundamentally a mindless replicator, was misleading, and that he probably should have gone with a more neutral title like The Immortal Gene.
Mm-hmm. Just like he probably should have gone with slightly smaller claims within the body of that book. I feel like Richard Dawkins is known for overstating his case.
Right. Well, I'm going to get to the pushback in a minute, but yeah, you're anticipating that. Dawkins believes that a society based simply on the gene's law of universal ruthless selfishness would be a very, very nasty society. But at the same time, he warns his readers that if they wish to build a cooperative society working for the common good, quote, you can expect little help from biological nature, end quote. His book received a lot of criticism, not least of which was that it served a social Darwinist narrative by finding an ideological and moral justification for selfishness and other bad behavior by modern human societies in the guise of simply following nature.
Right.
Dawkins said he found social Darwinism to be repugnant, and he was sensitive to and defensive about this critique of his work. I think there are good reasons for him to feel defensive. In the natural world, examples of cooperation are nearly as plentiful as those of competition, and genes that don't cooperate don't survive. Dawkins himself describes how selfish genes depend on many other genes in what he called an intricate cooperative venture of propagation, where advantages accrue to a gene that cooperates well with most of the other genes it depends on. Another criticism was that Dawkins over-extrapolated his theory, and in so doing was guilty of the fallacy of composition, which happens when you infer that something is true of the whole from the fact that it is true of some part of the whole. By projecting the property of gene selfishness onto everything built by genes, Dawkins reached the false conclusion that everything that has evolved should be selfish, even as advances in game theory have proven that generous cooperation can be a stable evolutionary strategy, leading to higher productivity than selfish behavior.
Yeah.
As one Dawkins critic put it, quote, there are evolutionary limits to selfishness. Nature ultimately eliminates all that damages what it depends on, end quote.
Right.
All that criticism made Dawkins rethink his work. In later editions of The Selfish Gene, he walked back some of his earlier claims, admitting that cooperation and mutual assistance can flourish. But he insisted that this didn't detract from his central thesis. He sought to adapt his theory to reckon with abundant evidence of human altruism that went far beyond the limited kin selection and reciprocal altruism described in his book. After all, humans now live in much larger groups that no longer include just kin, or just people who are likely to return our favors, and yet we still behave in the altruistic ways we did in our ancestral kin groups.
Mm-hmm.
Dawkins now understands this phenomenon as the quote-unquote misfiring of those same selfish genes. Here's what he means by that. Even though the evolutionary advantage is no longer there, we are still hardwired to be kind, and that leads to happy altruistic accidents like anonymous organ donation or charitable giving or weeping in sympathy at the plight of strangers.
Okay. So he's moved on from the position that the gene is selfish to the position that the gene is accidentally selfless. There's still no selflessness with intent. It's just a happy accident.
Boy, I need to think about that to say whether that does justice to his point of view. Yeah, I guess since he uses the word misfiring, that you're correct. Yeah. But what I want to point out here is that this modified Dawkins idea is consonant with a core belief in the field of evolutionary psychology, which holds that many perceived defects in rational choice are understood as rational in the context of the ancestral environment, but not necessarily in the current one. So the example I think of is gorging on food, you know?
Sure.
So our ancestors, when there was a fresh kill or some food brought into the camp, would gorge until they couldn't eat anything else. And that made total sense back then, because in the ancestral environment, food might be hard to come by. So get it when it's there, you know? But in the environment today, that it seems like irrational behavior, doesn't make sense. So I think that's what the evolutionary psychologists are getting at. And Dawkins is saying something like that, if you think about it.
Yeah, he just seems to have a fondness for words that are just a little bit provocative.
Yes.
And this is consonant with his very well-known career as a prominent atheist, is that he just kind of enjoys pissing people off, I feel like.
Yes. So speaking of rationality, you mentioned economics in your question, so I wanted to say a few words about its prominent role in the altruism-egoism debate. Classical and neoclassical economics, as developed by Adam Smith and refined by John Stuart Mill and many others in the 18th and 19th centuries, is rooted in a conception of the individual as a consistently rational and narrowly self-interested maximizer of utility, always pursuing his goals optimally. They named that dude Homo economicus, or economic man.
Mm-hmm.
As economics began to be thought of as a natural science, and economic and cognitive psychology emerged in the 20th century, researchers started to question whether Homo economicus was an accurate model of real human behavior. Now, for the sake of time, I admit this is a gross oversimplification of decades of important research that came to be known as behavioral economics. But the upshot was that much of the earlier dogma about rational, self-interested utility maximizers was, to use a technical term, bullshit.
Yeah.
Homo economicus was about as real as Sasquatch. Thus far in the 21st century, 6 Nobel Prizes for economics have been awarded to behavioral economists for, as one of the prizes stated, and I'm quoting again, establishing that people are predictably irrational in ways that defy economic theory, end quote. We're subject to all kinds of biases and fallacies that lead us to make errors that adversely impact our daily decision-making. From that tectonic shifting of bedrock economics has come, among other things, a more careful and nuanced examination of altruism as something that really does exist in the world. Here's some recent science examining the biological basis and benefits of altruism. Psychology researcher Abigail Marsh, whose own life was saved by the heroic actions of an altruistic stranger, studied the brains of both psychopaths and people who donated a kidney to a stranger, and concluded that the brains of the highly altruistic organ donors are as different from the rest of the population as those of the psychopaths, but in the opposite direction. For example, psychopaths had shrunken amygdalas, the portion of the brain that is the seat of our emotional responses, while the amygdalas of kidney donors were larger than average. Marsh also found that the kidney donor population exhibited a striking lack of self-centeredness and also displayed profound humility. Altruistic behavior has been observed in life forms as simple as the slime mold Dictyostelium mucoroides. Single-celled organisms that live as individual amoeba until they're starved, at which point they aggregate to form a multicellular fruiting body in which some sacrifice themselves to promote the survival of others in the body.
Yeah.
So be careful, Mark, the next time you call somebody a slime bucket, because you might actually be complimenting them.
Yes, I will. I'll definitely make note of that. I'm also reminded of ants that will find a way across a stream by, in some cases, drowning themselves so that other ants can pass over the top of them.
Yes, yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that because the pioneering scientist who studied ants just died last week. What's his name? Edward Wilson?
Um,
And he's actually a major player in these altruism debates, although I'm not going to speak about him in this episode. Biologists recently identified at least 7 candidate genes that may underlie altruism in both humans and social insects. Animal behaviorists report that birds that live in cooperating groups that share responsibilities live longer, are healthier, produce more offspring, and even solve tasks more quickly than their solitary peers. Neurobiologists have established through experimentation that altruism, instead of being a superior moral faculty that suppresses basic selfish urges, is instead part of the human brain's internal wiring and is pleasurable. It feels good to do good.
mm-hmm.
Psychological research supports the idea that altruistic behavior and happiness are bidirectional, meaning that not only do altruistic acts bring about happiness, but happier people are also kinder, and generosity increases linearly as one's mental state improves from sad to happy. Let's talk about Freakonomics for a minute. Freakonomics is the economics meets pop culture colossus. The co-founder of the Freakonomics franchise, New York Times journalist Stephen J. Dubner, has helped to popularize the notion that pure altruism doesn't exist, but he thinks we might be able to harness an impure version. If the entire multimedia Freakonomics franchise can be reduced to one catchphrase, it's that incentives matter a lot. And for all of economists' prior efforts to measure altruism, those incentives were seriously undervalued. For example, Americans donate an impressive 2% of GDP in charitable giving every year. But most of us are rewarded for that behavior with a tax write-off in April. After marshaling the economic and psychological research, Dubner concluded that, quote, "We can't say whether people are good people or bad people, altruistic or selfish. What we can say is that people respond to incentives and context," end quote. He believes humanity shouldn't have to depend on innate altruism because we know how to make people behave in good ways. Along the same lines, the evolutionary psychologist Max Krasnow argues that altruism is selfish by design in much the way Dawkins discussed. He cites both kin selection and reciprocal altruism, but that understanding this gives us the practical tools we need to, quote, grow more altruism in the world by engaging moral concern when it's useful or turning it off when it's not. Krasnow's research suggests that we calibrate our generosity to the kind of world we perceive ourselves to be in, using contextual cues like how much we expect to get in return or how long we expect the recipient of our kindness to remain in our lives. The extent to which we perceive a selfish interest in the transaction informs our altruism. But here's the interesting part. We can create what Krasnow calls levers. For example, medical interventions that increase life expectancy, policy interventions that reduce the rate of fraud, or financial interventions to give people opportunities to gain specialized skills. In other words, tools we can use, quote, to evoke more cooperative and altruistic norms around the world, end quote. Krasnow thinks the fact that the underlying motivations are selfish should not change the way we value the behavior, since the Good Samaritan is still good.
Yeah. So it's in service of a good cause. I'll give him that. It seems awfully paternalistic, though. That let's you don't need to rely on altruism or generosity at the individual level because a benevolent state is going to set up this system of incentives to engineer the sort of behavior that the state has decided is desirable. Am I alone in feeling a little uncomfortable with just how paternalistic that is?
No, you're not alone, but that is a big thing in behavioral economics and psychology right now. I think it's called nudge theory, that,
Yeah,
we should use the levers of public policy to move people in the right direction and not just assume they're going to do the right thing.
yeah, and I'm kind of receptive to that. I just hope that the people who are designing those nudges are taking a real hard look at the directions they're nudging people. Because imagine if we were designing nudges in, say, 1950s America and nudging people towards making sure that there's no marriages that are interracial, that sort of thing. Like, like you want
Yes.
to make sure that you are nudging people in ways that are not going to seem really objectionable 50 years down the road.
Yes. Yes. Point well taken. It certainly is paternalistic. Father knows best, right? Yeah. But
Yeah,
I think the reason I'm bringing this up is because these researchers acknowledge that altruism exists. They're just not sure it's a pure form of altruism, but it can certainly be marshaled to do good things in society.
okay.
That's really my point. And that brings me to my own view, which should come as no surprise based on what I've already said. Altruism is real. It exists. I think it just makes common sense that human motivations are not uniform. The two extremes that everyone seems to obsess over, pure altruists and pure egoists, are much less plentiful in the population than those who sometimes act altruistically, sometimes egoistically, and more often in ways that mix concern for the good of others with one's own good.
Sure.
In other words, it's much more likely that human behavior is a vast continuum ranging from people who exhibit virtually no altruism to those whose lives are marked by extraordinarily large sacrifices made for others, with the vast majority of us somewhere in the middle. As an article on altruism in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy concluded, quote, "This way of thinking has the great advantage of allowing our experience of each individual to provide us with the evidence by means of which we characterize him." End quote. At the beginning of this podcast, Mark, I asked you and our listeners to remember altruistic people in your own life. As the Stanford Encyclopedia article put it so eloquently, our first-hand experience of those individuals provides us with the evidence by which we can characterize them as altruistic. Does it really matter in the grand scheme of things whether their altruism lives up to some esoteric definition of purity? Does it matter whether my own altruistic impulses are pure? Mark, in your question last time you said, I like to think of myself as a pretty generous person. For my own part, I'd like to believe that I would run into a burning building to save the lives of my children. Now, Richard Dawkins would argue that this is kin selection, because half of my children's genes come from me.
Yeah.
But isn't it obvious that an adoptive father would risk his own life to save children who are not his genetic kin?
Absolutely. And I'm pretty sure that I would run into a burning building to save my dog. There's no
Yes.
kin selection going on there.
Yes. So I want to say that that type of altruistic behavior exists in the real world, and it benefits all of us. At the end of the day, I don't give a rat's ass whether some pointy-headed academic thinks it is or isn't pure. How about you?
I think you're on the right point there. I feel that it's ultimately kind of spurious to establish the bar so high that nothing can clear it and then declare that therefore it doesn't exist. Like, if we need laboratory conditions in which purity is an absolute as our definition of altruism, then of course the outcome is going to be then altruism does not exist because we've created the conditions in which that's the only possible outcome. But I think anyone who's paying attention and who's not suffering from clinical depression sees examples of people doing things just because it's a nice thing to do.
Yes.
Some of those things are big and some of those things are small. And if they walk away from that act feeling like with a little bit of spring in their step and feeling good about themselves, I do not see that as coloring the act. Like, I have a lower bar than that.
Right. And that's why I mentioned and encouraged you to think of people who are altruistic in your life, because the evidence of our own eyes also matters, putting aside all this scholarship. You know, just the other night at dinner, I was talking to my family about this question and kind of teeing up what I plan to say to you. And my wife and my 2 teenage kids and I got into this wonderful conversation about altruism and, really interesting ideas that they had. But ultimately, there's all these levels of theory and all this scholarship and all this experimentation. And then there's our own lived lives, and I just want to say, let's not forget our lived experience. Mm-hmm. Because if it looks like altruism and smells like altruism and sounds like altruism, it's probably altruism, whether or not Richard Dawkins thinks it exists.
Yeah. Okay. I'm right there with you.
Sure. You ready for your question for next time?
Bring it on.
About 5 years ago, some American diplomats in our embassy in Havana, Cuba, began reporting weird medical symptoms ranging from ringing in their ears to headache, nausea, vertigo, and even cognitive difficulties. Ever since then, other U.S. military, diplomatic, and intelligence personnel all over the world, including here at home, have been reporting similar symptoms. Though the U.S. government and some non-governmental organizations have been studying this matter, to my knowledge, there is still no known cause, only a bunch of wild-sounding theories to explain what's been dubbed Havana syndrome. Mm-hmm. The subject was recently in the news again because the just-signed defense appropriation bill contains some money for the victims of Havana syndrome. My question for you is this. What the heck is going on here? I'd like to hear your rundown of possible causes and which one you think is most likely. You up for that?
Okay. I'm starting on this one with a completely blank sheet of paper, so we'll have to see how it goes and whether or not I can get to the bottom of it. But I would do my very best to figure this out and to provide a solution to the world.
So I'm just curious, you never even heard of Havana syndrome? Or
I've definitely heard of Havana syndrome. I remember reading that there was some speculation that the communists in Cuba were aiming some sort of sound device at the walls of the embassy.
Yes.
And that possibly that was connected with some effort to spy on conversations inside the building, or possibly just to mess with the diplomats inside. But that was years and years ago, and I haven't heard anything since. So I'm going to have to catch up on the topic.
Yeah, well, there's lots of other juicy theories, and I think you're going to find it pretty interesting. And I'd love you to kind of sort through it and tell me which one is the most plausible, because I've been wondering about that myself.
Okay, I'll do my best.
All right.
So that's it for this week. If you have any thoughts on this episode or would like to leave comments on previous episodes, we do have a Facebook page. You can find it at Mansplaining the Podcast. And I hope you come by, give a like to our page, leave a few comments, or even pose a question, and we might answer it in a future episode. If you'd like to help other people discover this podcast and grow our audience to the point where we will become wealthy beyond our wildest dreams, please leave us a rating and a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. But that's it for now. I'm Mark. That was Joe. And thank you for spending some time with us.
Talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.